Hello, everybody, and welcome to today's webinar. I'm Elliot Levine, Research Director at the Aurora Institute, and I'll be facilitating today's webinar. And this webinar is part of a series of more than 20 webinars we're offering this fall on issues from the field of personalized competency-based education. And we'll put a link to all of our webinars in the chat box right now. The webinar series is a prologue to our annual Aurora Institute Symposium, which we'll be offering virtually this year on October 26th to 28th. So we hope you'll join us and visit our website for more information about that as well. And there's now a link in the chat box where you can get more information about the symposium as well. Next slide, please. Great, thank you. During today's webinar, we encourage you to use the chat box to help us get to know each other and learn from each other. You're welcome to ask any questions in the chat box at any time. Feel free to respond to other people's questions, share resources, and so on. We're happy to have a conversation going there to make it as helpful to you as possible. You can also share your thoughts about the webinar on Twitter using hashtag Aurora2020 and at Aurora_INST. Also wanted to let you know that today's session will be recorded and it will be available on our website within a day or two. We will be emailing you a link to the recording and the slide deck once it's available. Next slide, please. Great. Today, we're very fortunate to be joined by Jason Lange from BloomBoard and Amalia Lopez from the Lindsay Unified School District. Jason is co-founder and president of BloomBoard, which is a platform for professional learning through micro-credentials, which we'll be hearing more about in today's webinar. And Amalia Lopez is Director of Special Projects at the Lindsay Unified School District in California, which is one of the most advanced districts in the country in terms of their implementation of personalized competency-based education. Jason and Amalia, thank you so much for joining us today. And I'll turn it over to you, Amalia, to get us started. Thank you.
Thank you, Elliot. We're really happy to be here. So good morning or good afternoon to everyone, depending where you're dialing in from. Jason and I have a long-standing partnership. We have a lot of the same core beliefs. So we're really excited to share the work we do kind of as a partnership in how we build educator capacity, like Elliot said, notably on the topic of equity. Our outcomes today are really to help all of us kind of collectively think about diversity, equity, and inclusion. Then Jason will really walk us through some of the elements of the adult learning portal and what that looks like from BloomBoard on diversity, equity, inclusion, micro-credentials. And then I'm going to offer some examples of how we have done it in Lindsay Unified and how we have really implemented these competency-based approaches for our educators. But we're going to start today with a poll. It's nice because we're a nice tight little group here. Take a minute. Jason's going to drop in the chat for you a link to the poll. Bring up that and keep it up in a browser window. We're going to do a couple of initial kind of kickoffs to the thinking of the topic of equity, because I find that the more times we say equity, the less it means the same thing to everybody who's using the term. And so it's important to maybe ground ourselves a little bit. So take a minute and open up that link that Jason has dropped in the chat. And here's the first question. How do you define diversity, equity, inclusion in your organization or your work, whether it's a school district or a state board? Take a minute and in that poll response, just respond. How do you define diversity, equity, and inclusion? It could be a phrase, it could be a sentence, it could be a series of words. As responses start to come in, they'll start to just scroll on the screen and you can kind of compare your response to others. Definitely people having what they need to be successful. It's a common trend, a common theme of the work. Absolutely. We see a sense of belonging. Not only do people get the support that they need, but that they're welcome in the space. Individual stakeholder voice, and that stakeholder voice should drive district decisions, notably. We agree with that in Lindsay Unified as well. And so you see a lot of really good common trends of like, what do we mean by this work, no matter what space we're in? And it's really important to recognize that as that launches the work. And then we go one step further. And if we think about, okay, so if this is what diversity, equity, and inclusion mean to us, then the next question becomes, what have we done so far? And so in a minute, I'm going to change the poll. I want to give another quick 20 seconds to make sure everybody's poll responses get in. And then we drive into the next question. And what will happen is you'll just refresh your browser page. It's the same poll page. And now let's ask this question. Given that that's your definition, that's your kind of distinguishment that you work from for DEI work, what are some ways you've already attempted to build it in your organization, whether it's through your teachers and leaders, whether it's through your district leadership? What are some ways you've already tried to build DEI inside of your organization? And same thing, just type your answer into the poll. Absolutely. The part about being difficult resonates. It is truly difficult work. And Jason will talk a little bit about what that change management looks like. Absolutely. Exposure and awareness to the concepts. Absolutely. All of the things that we're seeing in both the concepts and how folks have already tried to implement them really resonates with the work that both Jason and I do. These are absolutely just very much in alignment where leveling power dynamics, thinking strategically about curriculum, absolutely, especially in a teaching workforce. Awareness really is step one. I personally feel like you've got to understand the concepts before you can change them. And so this is really the launching point for our discussion today, is that first think about the concept of what you mean for DEI in your context. Think about some of the ways that you've attempted it. And then Jason and I will kind of walk through some of the ways that we've looked at it and some of the ways we've done those same exact tasks. And so Jason, I'm going to advance over and let you take it from there.
Perfect. So again, really appreciate y'all taking time to chat with us today. Obviously, this is a super critical and super important topic. And so we're excited to share what we see from both Lindsay and from districts across the country. If you can go forward slide here. For those of you who don't know, just a really quick background on us, BloomBoard. So I founded the company about a little more than 10 years ago. We've done a lot of state level partnerships over the years, a lot of sort of pretty amazing, sort of fortunate to have some foundation backing, so the Gates Foundation, the Dell Foundations that are various amazing so impact investors, and really have been sort of trying to help organize and galvanize and support leaders and policymakers and sort of all the various crazy stakeholders in this system we live in to shift away from this seat time-based learning structure we have, where today, most everything we have as PD is you plug people into content, you track their attendance and you track the hours, and then you hope. You hope that it actually changes practice, you hope that it actually moves outcomes for kids. And what we know based on research is that just doesn't happen as much as we like, if very much at all, in the process. And so, especially when it comes to things like equity, where you've got really highly charged topics, it's just not a reasonable expectation that you can take the traditional PD model and apply it and use that same construct. And so a lot of the work we do is this idea of really thinking about competency-based advancement, certification, and ways to really fundamentally sort of move the needle in terms of practice, and really starting with what the outcomes we want to see in classrooms based on what teachers are doing. And so that's a little bit of our background. If you go to the next slide here. The analogy that I like to use, and I know we're all in a little bit of a survival skill mode right now, just given reopening and back to school, and I have 4 children in some form of virtual learning right now, so somebody will likely barge in that door at some point here. But the way we sort of like to talk about this is if you think about sort of one of their basic survival skills of building a fire. So if today I was tasked with helping train you on how to really build a fire, because you were going camping this weekend, right? In a traditional PD model, I might give you some reading material, have a workshop, give you some sort of reflection on it, share a video, and send you off. And that would be training. In the PD, so in the new model, if you go to the next sort of click here, in the competency-based learning model, really what we find is it's about sort of not only providing some basic knowledge building, so how do fires work, you know, what is airflow, how does airflow work, why are TPs important, but really then let's give you some tinder and a bunch of kindling and then have you go build 10 fires. And it turns out like that practice will really help you actually learn by doing in a much more effective way and actually translate to your own knowledge much better. And so if you go to the next slide here, really the idea is, right, if you had to survive a night in the woods, which option would you choose? And almost everybody talked to you certainly would choose the actual competency-based version because it's going to get you better results. That same model, if you go to the next slide, applies to the same sort of the diversity, equity, inclusion world, which is we know that these are uncomfortable, difficult, often highly charged conversations where people don't really feel comfortable to have the conversations that they need to have. And so we have to create some ways that people can learn by doing and get actual real feedback in their work, because that's the only way we're going to change that practice when it really comes down to sort of meaningfully doing the work in classrooms with kids. And so that same model is really what we use this construct, because the next slide here is really what we use this construct of a micro-credential. And the idea is that micro-credentials are not, if you click forward here one more, they are not really a course. They're not a module. It's not a, you know, a video series. It's not the traditional concept of sort of seat time where we plug people in. Really, they're more like, right, how you think about how you got your driver's license. Go back to the day where you actually did some driver's prep work. You probably drove with a parent or a sibling, and then ultimately you had to go down to the DMV where someone got into your car and they took out a checklist, they took out a rubric, and then they said, drive straight, take a left, take a right, parallel park, get on the highway. And you had to go through all of their work, and then you pulled back up the DMV and they said, either nice work, you passed, or nope, you got to come back next month and redo your parallel parking, and here's what you did wrong. And that model now can, rather than having somebody sort of do that in person, we can now do that using technology through video and through documentation and lesson plans and the like. And that's the idea behind the micro-credential, is we're codifying what does really effective practice look like? What does it look like in your classroom with your kids or in your schools with your teacher leadership teams? And then how do you demonstrate that? How do you capture that? And then how do we give you really good feedback on that work? So if you're familiar with the National Board process, it's sort of like a very discrete skill version of National Board. And we've been, just to give a quick overview, we've been taking that process, we go to the next slide here. We've been taking that process and across the country really been helping sort of organize it into all of the various sort of interesting examples of where licensure and policy making is sort of taking place. And so in the national landscape, we cover everything from new teacher induction programs, where new teachers are working with their mentors on, rather than submitting that 3-inch binder of paper that people submit in March and got feedback on 10 months later in red pen, which obviously isn't super helpful for anyone. We're sort of taking that process and having teachers actually document their routines and procedures, for example, as one of those competencies. And so they work with their mentor, they videotape their routines and procedures, they upload that, they get feedback within 5 days saying, yes, great work, you've actually demonstrated good routines and procedures, or nope, you got to resubmit, why don't you're directing students too much, why don't you sort of do this, this, and this to make sure you're improving practice. And that we've started doing that into all sorts of different licensure and endorsement add-ons, so computer science endorsements, and STEM endorsements in different social emotional learning areas, and then a bunch of the high need teacher licensure pathways, so gifted and talented, ESL, special education and the like. And then we're even doing some work, the purple states is sort of this in the CTE category, where we're actually providing alt-cert pathways for different CTE endorsements. And then the last big one is really around leadership. And so we've got a bunch of states who are really looking at, states like Illinois, who are actually creating principal designations for leadership around equity principles. And we'll talk a little bit about that in a second. Louisiana is another example of really some amazing work where they've replaced teacher leader licensure with micro-credentials. So it's no longer takes a multiple choice test for you to become a mentor, which is required for anybody working with student teachers, but you actually now have to videotape yourself having a one-on-one mentoring conversation with your mentee and showing how you're providing really targeted feedback on that teacher's growth plan. And that's really part of now the process to become a mentor in that state. And so that just gives you a sort of a rough sample. As we think about how this translates into DEI, we really started to dig into some of the data, and obviously going down to the student perception data started to become really interesting. And so Panorama did, this is actually obviously pre this past summer and all of the craziness of the last few months, but even as of October of last year, pre-COVID and the like, right, we still know that student perceptions of equity, of diversity, of inclusion are already really not great. And so this chart shows you the sort of the left-hand column here are the axis is really percentage of students with positive perceptions around diversity and inclusion, which starting in 6th grade go down really quickly as you get into high school. And that as you break that data down into the far right chart, right now, as you get into sort of demographic groups, right, gets even worse in the process. And so really, I think what we're trying to sort of do is even before all of the George Floyd murder, all of the other sort of issues that we've seen in the last several months, right, the data here is not good. And we know that this is important. We know that this is a problem that our schools really have to deal with. And so it started to bring up a lot of really interesting questions around, well, what do we need to do to help teachers and leaders really effectively support DEI for all students? What does that need to look like? And then because of the highly charged nature of the topic, what does it look like to model this work? And how do you really support, and what are the implications for implementation when you have a structure that really needs support, where you've got to create some space for people to operate? And then ultimately, and this is probably one of the things we talk about most, which is it is almost impossible to think about DEI as just another PD. And the reality is that this is really fundamentally culture change. And if you're not treating it as such, I can guarantee you it will not be successful. And once you start to think about it as culture change, then you start to think about the implementation and the support process in a much different way, because you recognize that this has to be a long game and that this is really about systemic culture rather than any specific, sort of points for, some tactical add-on or some support structure in place. And so like most, sort of research wonks, we've taken a pretty research-centric view to this work. As we started to get into this, we started to look at what is the best research to inform this work. And this is where I think it's been really hard to parse out, right, all of the various, sort of different verticals in this work. And what we found is that there's really 4 overlapping yet distinct sort of bodies of research starting to inform where diversity, equity, inclusion goes. And so you've got the whole Zaretta Hammond culturally responsive instruction world. You've got a bunch of new really interesting research around restorative justice, which overlaps quite a bit with this whole trauma-sensitive instruction layer. And my wife is a social worker, and so there's been a ton of really interesting work in the social working world around trauma and its impact on the brain and its impact on how people handle their current situations. And then really sort of as a throughput to all 3 of those, you've got this whole social emotional learning lens. And so as you start to think about that body of work, if you go one more forward, really what we've realized is that the leadership component to this actually has to exist almost first, and at least in parallel, if not first, because at the end of the day, going back to that cultural change management process, it's a leadership question. And where you have leaders who really can prioritize this, right, that's where you're going to see the most gains. And so one of the really most interesting sort of seminal pieces of this work came from the Tennessee Department of Ed a few years ago, called the Leadership for Equity, the Leaders for Equity Playbook. And what they built as part of this body of research that the Wallace Foundation funded was this playbook really focused on these core leadership commitments. So what does it look like as a school leader to try to decrease chronic absenteeism, reduce disproportionate expulsion and suspension rates, really try to increase early post-secondary opportunities for students and connect them to career readiness, right, if not college readiness. And then how do you think about sort of the whole pipeline world? So equitable access to effective teachers, teaching workforce and retaining talent in that process. And then really this whole sort of cultural competence area where what does it look like for school cultures to be culturally competent, and how do you engage with your communities in and around your school in that process? And so as part of this work, we did a lot of work, sorry, go back one. We did a lot of work to try and codify those core commitments into these 5 micro-credentials. And the idea is that each of these micro-credentials basically defines that portfolio of what a leader needs to be able to do and produce in their classroom, in their schools, as part of the leadership team meetings, as part of this work, to really demonstrate these core commitments. And that started to then codify the leadership route. And then really we've now just started in this last several months trying to think about what does it mean to then translate that into classroom practice. And what we really started to, as we got more and more feedback from districts, what we've realized is that there just isn't going to be a single solution to districts, the reality is we're going to sort of try to codify these practices across each of these areas and then let districts really choose how do they want to prioritize and organize these core competencies relative to the things that they prioritize in their data. And so if you go to the next slide, what we've really started to do is tease out what are the specific core competencies within classrooms that matter. So there's a lot of great CASA work around SEL and around student agency and awareness that's really important. There's a bunch of work around restorative justice and trauma-sensitive instruction and sort of more equity and cultural responsiveness, and then ultimately this sort of community engagement component. And what we know is depending on the district, depending on your size, urban, suburban, rural, all districts are going to choose different structures, different sort of core competencies that they want to prioritize based on where they are in that change management process. And so this just helps codify some of these core things. And so what Amalia had this great idea around, like, given that this is pretty broad, what would it look like to actually have the folks on the phone, the folks on the presentation here, actually just start to choose and say, like, what do you think are the most sort of important competencies here in your own work? And so the pretty cool sort of poll structure here is this actually allows you to actually, when you think about sort of defining DEI now and sort of standardizing and codifying that work in classrooms, you can actually click on the screen here and actually go, if you go to that poll anywhere sort of link, you can actually click on the screen and you can really use this to start to create some feedback for the group to talk about, well, what really matters here? And so that's what we sort of invite you right now, sort of click back on that same polling link. And then if you want to go sort of click in, you can actually jump in and click on the competencies that come to mind as you then think about how it translates to your view of what DEI will look like in your schools.
I like that some people just clicked right at the top of equity, like all of them.
Totally.
That's what I would have done. I'd have been like,
Amazing.
I want the whole category.
Well, it's interesting. It also sort of gives you a little bit of sense of just how big the problems are, and therefore this realization that you can't tackle all of this at once. And I think that's part of this question is you've got to really be strategic about, again, where are you really trying to get behavior? I know we're working a couple of different places in Texas and other places where they're looking at, data problems around suspension rates. And so it's a suspension data defined behavior problem that they're trying to solve, rather than other districts working with where it's really around some of the broader sort of cultural responsiveness. And it ends up being, depending on where you are, you end up being more proactive or reactive, depending on what your actual sort of data looks like today.
It's interesting to see how many are now getting the multiple hits, so to speak, Jason.
Mm-hmm.
I would have also picked developing a climate of respect and rapport. Absolutely. That would have been one of my first ones.
Give folks another couple seconds here. And hopefully this is also helpful to give you a sense of just how intermingled these bodies of research are. And so that is, I think, one of the challenges of the field is that there isn't agreement, and it's okay that there's not agreement, but there isn't agreement yet on sort of this overlap and this alignment. And obviously, resilience and trauma have a lot of sort of interrelated work. And so part of what we've started to look at is now, how do you then support that process? And what is the role of coaching, which we really have a bias towards? What is the real role of coaching? And I think one of the things we've started doing is a lot more work around sort of actually creating a set of equity coaches to really support the structure. And the realization is, what we started to do is, even if we're just doing work around mindset, what we started to realize is, because this is pretty highly charged and pretty uncomfortable work, the more scaffolding you create for people, the more they're willing to lean in and engage. And people, as much as we would like all learners to be really wonderful and engaging, right? Asynchronous learning just does not really work in the context of sort of highly charged topics. And so even if you get people together, you have to have facilitators and coaches that can really guide and model what difficult conversations, what courageous conversations look like. And so we've started really using and experimenting quite a bit with this idea of these equity coaches, and then creating simultaneous admin cohorts and teacher cohorts that can be working through the same topics, working through the same similar content areas, but are doing so in parallel. And so you've got teachers working on classroom practices and admins working on school practices, and that's a really important part of the work in terms of driving that change management. because you can still work on discrete things, but it allows you to sort of manage that process. And so typically what we're doing is trying to then build this into a broader change management plan from an implementation standpoint. And I can talk a little bit about how they sort of manage their work, but really the idea is you're sort of running your cohorts and you're really helping give people space and time to be able to have the conversations they need to have, but recognizing that you just can't, you're not going to change this. This isn't point in time, right? We've got 5 PD days before the kickoff of school and we're going to solve our equity problem. It just doesn't work like that. You've got to take a much more systemic lens and really have a much more regular cadence for how you're talking and embedding equity into your work. And so that's a lot of what we're really helping and trying sort of helping focus on in the process. And just as context, just so I know, this gets a little bit more into the weeds, but we can sort of go through this quickly, is the way the micro-credential structure is built is really actually around the same sort of inquiry cycle. If you're familiar with the 5 E's model for STEM education and project-based learning, it's really built in that same way around, but using this sort of educator-centric lens, which is, as we guide for every one of those, PLCs, you're basically guiding people through, or the coaches are guiding people through an actual sort of cycle of inquiry where they're orienting around what the competencies are, what the competency is, and why it matters. Then they're engaging in some core content to build some knowledge and really understand the sort of core focus areas and the core background knowledge that you need. But then it's really teeing up a series of exercises that where people are going to go back to their schools and they're going to actually work with their school leadership teams. They're going to work with their, a teacher or a mentee that they might be working on, and they're going to do some work to actually produce a body of evidence and a portfolio that shows how they started to implement this work. And that may not be the first time they build that body of evidence. It might not be the right one because they're practicing and they're getting feedback, but ultimately they're going to build a good portfolio that shows demonstration of that skill. And that's where a third party can then say, yep, nice work. You really did a great job here. Or no, you might want to tweak this, this, and this because this is going to get you more impact and this is going to be more systemic in terms of that change in practice. And then ultimately, I think the goal would be is to be able to evaluate that and really start to embed it in, the future of advancement. So we've seen lots of districts start to now move down this path to say, right now we have a pretty archaic lane change structure in education where your plus 15, your plus 30 gets you advanced salary, and that's all based on seat time that is pretty costly. And that we know the future of advancement is going to be linked to actual outcomes and linked to sort of demonstration, and that it's really you're already starting to see, folks with 10K master's programs, 5K master's programs, depending on the state. And so it's going to be much cheaper, and it's going to also satisfy a lot of the actual sort of incentive structures in place. And that using this competency-based model can also just create a much better sort of efficacy model in place as well. And so we're starting to see folks, if we go to the next slide here, take this same approach, but then also embed it into these sorts of systems where, you've got a 30 credit hour master's program, but you're taking some of those equity components and you're embedding it inside of those masters, right, sort of credit equivalents in micro-credential form, and all of a sudden you've got a way for teachers to be able to engage in really meaningful content, but also actually move towards lane change, which again helps actually with some of the vulnerability factors. I mean, if you think about what it takes, getting a traditional credit hour in a seat time based model, there's no vulnerability because you show up and that's sort of it. In a model where you're actually videotaping yourself and uploading it into the black box of the internet where someone can give you feedback, it's much more vulnerable. And so part of the way we've heard districts really start to think about helping move the needle in getting engagement is to use this sort of advancement structure. But it also creates a ton more flexibility. So those that, micro-endorsement 2 and 3 on the right there, if you go to the next slide, we're seeing states already start to move towards using a great deal of personalization. And so a teacher could not only, have a set number of micro-endorsements they're working on, but they can then start to choose from a bunch of other micro-endorsements that may have even licensure implications, and they're co-mingling and they're basically developing a very customized advancement pathway that's really specific to their interests, but is still at the same time getting them an increase in salary in that same process. And so we can sort of cover on that, but you can cover on.
Oops, sorry. I think I got a little
No problem.
happy there, Jason. And
no problem. Go ahead.
I was so concerned about not clicking on time. So one of the great things about all the things that Jason laid out is if you are a district, like I am a school district administrator at Lindsay Unified, which we'll talk about in just a minute, and you are trying to find a way to build educator capacity, you start to come across, we should really think of our educators like we think of our kids. all of our K-12 kids have different needs and different levels, and they just need different levels of personalization. And so that really launches to where Lindsay Unified began to partner with BloomBoard, and we began to like really take this work on. And if you don't know, Lindsay, California is in Central California. If you are thinking of the beaches in California, we are not near there. We are by the cows. And we are rural, we are agricultural. 97% of our learners are Hispanic Latino. Anywhere from 50 to 60% of those at any given time are English learners, and anywhere to 30% of those are both migrant and or homeless. We are a community of poverty, and it's always important when you're thinking about DEI that context drives your conditions for DEI work. What is the context that you serve? Who are the learners that you serve? And then from there, you think about the DEI work that is involved. And in 2007, we began a journey into personalized competency-based learning for our K-12. We have a nationally recognized model. I know Natalie dropped the slide deck in the chat. I've got the video if you want to hear more about Lindsay. And we've been doing competency-based learning for our learners since about 2009. And what we've learned is that it's a very powerful shift in support. It's a very powerful shift and change in culture. And so Jason mentioned DEI work is culture change. Culture change is the normal, I tell people in Lindsay Unified. That idea that you constantly refine and shift and push yourself, that's our norm, and that's who we are. And so when about 2017, we began to think about our educators, and we began to wonder, why hadn't we treated our educators the same way? Why hadn't we set conditions for professional learning and educator development that were the same? Why don't we think of our educators like our learners? And we began to work on a mindset and a culture change shift for our educators, which is, you too are a learner. You deserve a pathway of professional learning. You deserve choice in not only depth, but duration, but also how you demonstrate what you're learning. And we began to really foster that same mindset. And we really began to do two things at once. We not only began to build this model of culture change and professional learning, notably including DEI, but also we began to test it in research, and we continue to test it. What works? What is actually creating behavior change in adults, and which of these professional learning experiences is actually starting to implicate inside of student achievement? And so for the last 3 years, and we are continuing on this path, we've been not only building this customized professional learning pathway for our educators, but we've been testing it in research, intentionally trying to study it, learn from it, and pivot from it. And it looks a little bit like this, where you have everything down from some educators still need one-day workshops, depending on the topic. If you're teaching guided reading, they have to see somebody demonstrate how to do the manipulatives, the word phonics skills, all those kinds of things, all the way up into learning academies and micro-credentials, but even into graduate learning and self-paced courses and master's degrees. And we really built out a full pathway for our educators to choose from. And BloomBoard's DEI micro-credentials, we actually kind of housed under our online self-paced courses. Because one of the benefits was it would allow not only the micro-credential certification, but it really allowed a lot of flexibility in how an educator learned and how they interacted with it from a time-based standpoint. And it overlaps with a really big shift in our district towards that idea of an equity lens. Like most school districts, we think really intentionally about equity, and we really wanted to start to do it better. And so in 2018, our district did form an equity leadership team. We wrote a vision statement that we were really going to foster awareness. We were going to really foster understanding, because like many of you identified earlier on in the poll, what equity means to us is that every learner leaves our system saying, I got what I needed, because what every learner needs is different. And we began to consider what that worked. And so we did various things. We had a team of us that were district leadership. Like Jason said, we thought it was really important to start with leadership, that were working on it. Our superintendent, Tom Rooney, tasked me with reaching out to experts in the field. And what I unanimously found in my conversations with them was this: the best DEI work starts inside your district. The best DEI work starts with internal team learning and your own audit of your own learners. Look at where your learners are vulnerable. Ask yourself what processes and systems are in their way. And so we really took that to heart, and we wanted to make it a way that it was part of our district work already, that we could apply this equity lens to the current mission and vision of our work, because the mission and vision that we've been on since 2007, we don't want to interrupt it. We don't want to make it a different thing. We want the equity work to support it. And I kind of stumbled across Jason and the equity micro-credentials in the Tennessee playbook. It was one of the best stumbles I ever did. And like Jason mentioned, this playbook was published right around that same time. And what we found was it was an excellent starting point for us as a district. I did link that playbook for you in the slide deck, because when we looked at this as a district, it was one of the best starting points. Like Jason said, what does DEI mean for you? Well, like many districts, we have some chronic absenteeism, but we actually thought, no, we have a serious gap in how we get some of our learners into post-secondary opportunities, given the rural agricultural nature of our area and that we're a community of poverty. We also realized we don't have a workforce that represents our students. Our learners are 97% Hispanic Latino. We also realized that one of the biggest ones was equitable access to effective educators. And that's a big one, because that comes down to quality instruction. It comes down to all different things. And so we realized from this framework, there was a lot for us to learn. There was a lot for us to consider and look at for our district. And that was where those micro-credentials that were based on this framework became a really powerful tool for us. And inside of them, that competency-based experience, what we did is in about 2018, we launched with all 4 of them with our whole entire district strategic leadership team. And the goal was to first get everybody to do the one called exploring and deepening an equity mindset. And that was intentional because that essentially, I tell people, that's like, what is equity? And there's a variety of things in there. All of them are built with outcomes and rubrics and all those good things. But ultimately, that one peels back the layer. You take the Harvard Implicit Association tests online, which was a really interesting experience. You go through a variety of learning experiences where you have to actually kind of look in the mirror and say, what does equity mean to me? What does it mean for the population that I serve? And what's the data that I will look at? And so we had our entire leadership team take on the exploring and deepening an equity mindset because it was a starting point. It was one of the most important starting points that before we could tackle some of these other problems, we had to first kind of come to consensus about what equity meant in our district, what it meant for our kids, what it meant in terms of developing educators. And inside of them, all of them have a clearly outlined competency, and that was really helpful, especially because we're a competency-based district. We talk to our kids this way, so we definitely wanted to be talking to our educators this way, which is, what am I trying to accomplish? What is the competency at hand here? There are rubrics articulating proficiency, questioning and reflection prompts, which was, you know, I'm a former English teacher many moons ago, high school English teacher, and I'm a lover of rubrics. Give me a rubric and tell me what I'm aiming for. And so we were able to work together as a team. Lots of us partnered up to work on our evidence together because we just really wanted to tackle it as partners and really think through it together. And the part that I thought was most interesting, because Jason mentioned a word earlier, he said vulnerable. They give you lots of research and lots of things you can learn from inside of those micro-credentials, but ultimately it's a vulnerable experience because you are videotaping yourself, you are peeling back layers, you are admitting to things. And I tell people who are district leaders, it is forcing you to peel back the layers on your district. It is so easy to champion good things that we do in districts. It is so easy to say, we have made so much growth. Look at our data. I was talking to an educator recently that said, well, we're finally, you know, 75% of our kids are reading at grade level. And I said, what about the other 25? Because if the other 25 was your children, would that be okay? And so when you work inside of these DEI micro-credentials, you are starting to not only peel back the layers of data for yourself and what you believe, but you have to look at the other parts of your data. You have to ask yourself, why do we still have these populations of learners that aren't being successful? We aren't providing them everything that they need. And why is that? And what's the root cause behind those things? And so that authentic evidence that we had to build really forced us into a different space. And they were self-paced, which was really helpful because, you know, if you're a principal, no matter what your role is in a district, you have a lot going on. And you have to kind of manage the time. And so we saw some people finish these and each one 6 weeks, give or take. We saw some take 4 or 5 months. I think I took about 5 months on mine because I worked really fast initially and then got bogged down with things. And then I had to go back to it. And that's kind of the beauty of it though, which is, let's undo the constructs of time on educator development. Let's actually think about, if we believe that for kids, do we believe that for adults, and that they can develop in spurts and they can develop in little sprints of learning, and can they apply that learning and then revisit it? And this was a really beneficial approach for us because we really wanted to get to a place where step one was we all agreed about what DEI meant in Lindsay, because what it means in Lindsay is different than what it means other places, and that's okay. It's okay to have that reality and say, we want to make sure every Lindsay learner gets what they need. Because interestingly enough, what they need has changed since March. And that's a really important reflection. What every learner needs to be successful right now has not only changed since March, but it's changing weekly. All of us in district leadership can admit that to each other. It changes weekly. School expectations are changing. Technology expectations are changing. And so we have to consider constantly, now what does it mean? Now what do the kids need? And so to move the mindsets on equity, we had a really successful launch with our leadership, but it was not a standalone endeavor. It wasn't, let's just do these micro-credentials and then, gosh, we're all going to have arrived, because that's a false assumption. Instead, we combined it with a research-based framework, which I also linked there, called the Instructional Look-Fors, which we are actively using in Lindsay to develop our educators. It's a framework we built under a Gates grant with Summit Public Schools and Transcend Education and the Columbia Public Research Lab of actions for personalized learning and behaviors for both students and teachers. We also brought in the cost of poverty simulation called COPE. And if you've never heard of that, it's one of the most powerful things you can do to train your staff. And we put all 600 of our staff through the cost of poverty, which was they simulate the life of someone in poverty for 4 weeks, so to speak. And it's a very powerful simulation that really, truly supports DEI work, especially if you're like Lindsay in your community of poverty. And so the micro-credentials were not something that we kind of took on by themselves. It was part of a much larger, broader vision of to move mindsets, to change culture, because our context demands it. What does it look like and how do we accomplish this? What are the different levers that we move in tandem? And so you start to slowly move things in tandem, because the cost of poverty made the soil ripe with our educators to talk about equity and to talk about diversity. Ironically, we did the cost of poverty simulation in January of this year, unbeknownst that the pandemic was coming, that school closure was coming, and that the poverty would exponentially exacerbate in Lindsay, California because of the pandemic. And so the idea that these things work together can really start to push that needle and change that culture. We are looking towards another series. Jason and his team actually have a series coming for prospective teacher leaders and principals and different levels of educators. We are definitely looking towards those because there's so much power in that idea of building the fire instead of just reading about building the fire, like Jason said, because we want folks who can build the fire. We want them we want folks who are going to engage the change management in live time for the DEI work of our district. We are going to actually run probably some kind of an internal equity audit across our district, which is what all the experts that I spoke to recommended, which is really identify across your system where you have protocols and things that are blocking learners and processes that are hurting kids. And we're going to continue professional learning pathways on these DEI micro skills like Jason showed. That map that he had you choose from, that's a very powerful map for me because there's so much good stuff in there. And then the question becomes, in what combination do we bring them into our district? And so looking at those micro skills and thinking about which ones do we push on right now and which ones do we wait for later, which ones are foundational, which ones are maybe a little bit slightly more of an advanced competency for our district. Because ultimately, the educator development to move the needle, to change the culture of your district, it's not a static concept. It evolves. What we mean by DEI and Lindsay right now might be different a year from now. It might be different 2 years from now. It might be different next month, given the way that 2020 is going. And the reality is, as district leaders, we have to continuously evolve as well, because serving with equity has to meet the moment. And the moment we're in means giving every learner what they need is going to keep changing. And that's actually the competency we want in our leaders. We want them to have the capacity to continuously meet the moment as well. Our teachers and our leaders need that thing. And so that's where all of this for us, that competency-based approach to educator development has become a very powerful mover of change, because we're basically saying to our educators and Lindsay, we believe, just like we believe for kids, that you deserve a personalized path for learning, even when the topic is as sticky as equity, as DEI work. And or sticky might be the loosest word I can use for it. But I'm going to stop there and go ahead and we'll take a minute for any questions. You're welcome to ask about any parts of the slide deck. You're welcome just to come off of mute or to put it in the chat. I can pop the chat up. But questions that you'd like us to dig back into. It's a running joke that Jason and I talk too fast. So I'm sure there's somebody who was like, could you repeat that?
We knew we'd have time.
Yeah. Yeah, that's as slow as Jason and I can go. Questions from either off of mute or in the chat, we're open to either. Otherwise, it's been wonderful. Maybe they just listen as fast as we talk, Jason.
There you
go. So Elliot's got a question of, are there examples of the micro-credential model of certification managing teachers changing districts or states, or whether the credentials would transfer? So Jason, that's definitely a question for you.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, certainly a lot of the work we do across country is policy-based. Unfortunately, there isn't really much policy today around equity and DEI There are a couple of states, so Illinois is looking at whether or not they would actually run a district equity scorecard. I know there are a couple of other states that have started down this process of trying to get some level of data about equity more transparent. And the reality is today it's just not. And so it's a really hard, there aren't sort of equity endorsements, there aren't actual sort of structures. Illinois, the leadership for equity is an actual add-on that can go on a principal's license. And so it's a nod towards that, but there's nothing that says that you have to have that to become a principal. It's sort of an additional bump for principals in the future hiring pipelines. But it's definitely, I mean, this is really, I think, had started 2-3 years ago where people started to realize this is a priority. Obviously, that's accelerated exponentially in the last several months. And so I think we will expect more work around equity happening. And certainly some of our university and graduate partners around sort of this idea of advanced degree structures around equity are really, really interesting. And so we'll see more of it, but we're not there yet.
Yeah, and to build on that, California is one of the states that does not recognize it. And so as a district, you have to think creatively because they aren't going to get any state licensing credit. They aren't going to get anything towards their credential. And so districts have to really be much more willing to, I say, stipend or, incentivize it a little bit to make sure that the learning happens and structured that way. Other questions in the chat, what are some of the biggest issues you encountered implementing equity work? So I can definitely speak to that. Biases are tricky. It's really hard to, as a district, look yourself in the face and say, what are our biases and things like that. And so one of the biggest issues that we continue is our educators seem to sometimes want to view it as it's an additional thing. What's this new thing we're talking about? Versus saying, no, equity is part of all things. Equity is part of every system we already have in place, whether it's attendance, curriculum and instruction, whether it's suspension and behavior, whether it's community stakeholder input and interaction. One of the biggest challenges for all districts, I think, is making equity part of all work, where it is not this thing on the side. It is not this thing over here. Oh, now let's talk about equity. Good, we're done with that. Now let's come back over here. How is equity part of the driving of all the systems? And so I would say that's, as a district leader, that's one of the ongoing pieces of work you have to do. You have to keep re-emphasizing that equity is the underpinning, the foundation of all good work in the district. And another question in the chat was, if you had to do it again, I love this one, would you start with the competency-based with kids or adults? Oh, I'd still start with kids. Absolutely. I was a first-year teacher in Lindsay Unified when we began our competency-based approach, and the impact that had on our learners, how fast the culture changed, how fast they began to believe, how fast we empowered them. It taught me a really important lesson. Adults are the problem. It's not the kids. And it really still resonates with me today, is that starting with the kids was the best thing we ever did. And we started at the high school level. So I was there that first year that we started the model at the high school. And I saw how fast we could actually change what learners felt about themselves, that academic urgency, that agency and empowerment. And it was powerful. And so, yeah, I love that question, but boy, I'd always start with the kids because I don't think kids are the problem. I think adults are. Sometimes that's not a problem.
Yeah, and the only thing I would add there is I do think that this question of agency just keeps coming up over and over again. Yeah. And I mean, the beauty of this sort of competency-based structure is it just changes where agency lives. And whether you start with kids, whether you start with girls, it's the number one thing we hear from teachers is it all of a sudden puts the empowering and the onus back on you to do the work, because that's just not the system we live in. And unfortunately, most of our education system, has beaten agency out of our kids by the time you get to middle school, high school. And I think lots of folks are seeing that now in the COVID virtual learning days, where kids are at home being like, tell me what I'm supposed to do next. And if there's not good agency, if you don't have that, it makes the system much harder. And so starting with that competency-centered view really sort of has a much different lens on agency and how it lives in. And apparently, to be clear, when you get to those sort of sticky, highly charged topics like equity, agency has to exist first. And so I think that's really where you've got to want to be able to change, and where we've seen, I think educators are predisposed to wanting, to do good work. And the question is then, where are the levers and where's the high leverage for doing that? And this idea of how you really recognize bias and where it exists, and the fact that it exists everywhere, is just a different mindset. And so that's actually why we start with the mindset work, because there are plenty of folks who still, I think, don't necessarily equate equity and equality and think about the sort of distinctions around where bias exists. And they still want all kids to do well, but it really sort of comes into sort of what does that mean when it comes to, again, trauma and all the other sort of poverty conditions that Amalia mentioned, which is just really powerful sort of perspective.
And there's another question. I think this might be for something you mentioned, Jason. Regarding the student perception survey, how many students were surveyed and where were the students from?
I can get that data. I know Panorama actually did a survey, did a whole blog post on it when they released that report. I can try and get that. I think if you Google the Panorama Diversity, Equity, Inclusion Survey, they'll have the blog post that has the data specifically backing it.
You might just type the name of that in the chat so that they can just pull it for a Google search. Absolutely. Good questions though. Absolutely. Other questions before we close up today and wrap up and I pass it back to Elliot? Any last questions? Feel free to put them in the chat or just come off of mute and ask. Those are good ones though. Okay. And Elliot, I'll go ahead and pass it back to you.
Great, thank you so much, Amalia and Jason. It's been really terrific hearing about all of your work in Lindsay's Unified School District and really giving us some practical ideas about how to move forward equity work in schools and in districts, really some concrete steps, as well as a recognition of the enormity of it and the fact that it's steps, but that the big solution is going to take you know, a very long period of time and really good ways to get started here. We're really looking forward to hearing more over time. Excuse me. We also appreciate everyone who attended today, pardon me, and all of your participation in the chat box and the polls. It would be really helpful to us if you could click on this link to our feedback survey, which is in the chat box now. It's just 3 questions and should take about a minute to complete. Next slide, please. While you're finishing up the survey, I do want to share some more information about our webinar series. Here you can see 8 of our upcoming webinars in October and November, and they're on a variety of topics to advance your work in personalized competency-based education, including some that are more specific to remote learning and the pandemic, and others on more general topics, such as we have one tomorrow on high school internships, and actually another one on that topic coming up, building educator capacity for equity. So building on today's discussion, using flexible scheduling, using performance assessments. So lots of relevant webinars for our advancing our work in competency-based education. You can find detailed descriptions and register for these webinars on our website, and there's a link for that in the chat box. And next slide, please. As I mentioned earlier, our Aurora Institute Symposium will be held virtually this year on October 26th through 28th. So we hope you'll join us. Visit our website for more information, and there's also a link for that in the chat box. And next slide, please. Again, thanks to everyone for participating in today's webinar. And we invite you to stay connected with us at the Aurora Institute. Some of our contact information is here. Please join me again in thanking Jason Lange from BloomBoard and Amalia Lopez from the Lindsay Unified School District for their terrific presentation today. And we look forward to seeing you all again soon.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And take care.
Have a good